Bible scholars here. Can't get anything past you guys. Which is the description of the siege of the capital city of the northern kingdom. Remember, we're in the time period of the divided kingdom, which requires terrible and long exile to restore. And that's one thing that I try to mention with some regularity, that is that the divided kingdom was only divided until God dragged both kingdoms into exile and held them there, and they came back and they were reunited. So there should be some recognition of the blessing of that fact that the divided kingdom became a unified kingdom through that exile. It was not strictly judgment on them, but right now we're in the divided kingdom. Elisha is ministering in the northern part of that divided kingdom. And we read this terrible story about cannibalism within Samaria, which was a prophesied element, right? Deuteronomy 28:53. Very operative at this point in Israel's history, very poignant descriptions where it was literally prophesied that they would be eating their own children because of a famine in the land that was caused directly by their failure to adhere to particularly the Mosaic covenant and the law therein, but also denigrating the Abrahamic covenant, right? So Abrahamic covenant being the unconditional covenant, the one that will come to pass, but it was administered through the Mosaic covenant to a particular generation, right? It was a promise of blessing based upon their obedience and faithfulness in the land, and that was a conditional covenant for each generation. So something like that exists other places. Remember that David had two covenants. We call one the Davidic covenant, which is the one that forever and ever and ever the eternal kingdom would be ruled by one of his heirs, a single righteous man that would come of his line and would rule. But there was a conditional generational covenant that if every descendant of David, every heir to his throne, were to walk with the Lord, right, that they would have the right to occupy the throne. And as long as they did so, nobody would go into exile. They would suffer discipline in the land. They would suffer judgment in the land. They would suffer difficulty. But as long as the king was faithful and walking with the Lord, they would not be taken into exile. Now, there's a prophetic element to that too, also in Moses' writing, where it says that's not going to happen because you are going to go into exile. You're going to be dragged out of the land eventually. Eventually, the king is not going to do that. Anyway, so we read about that. It was a matter of prophecy. It's important to remember that when we read prophecy, we should expect, literal direct fulfillment of things, right? When we read prophecy, that is the standard. And so when Scripture says that we will be caught up with Christ in the air, that does not mean that you're living a life of raptured bliss right now, right? Because that's not the rapture, because you haven't been caught up in the air. If you find yourself hanging in the air, expect to fall and die, right? Because you haven't met Jesus in the air. All right, so that's our expectation for prophecy. So here we are in chapter 7. Remember, Elisha gave a near prophecy, right? Because what's happening? Well, a donkey head, what was it, 80 shekels of silver was the donkey head. Nobody's supposed to be eating donkey heads, but everybody was eating donkey heads before they got to their children. And they were paying 80 shekels for a donkey head in this. And Elisha says something. This is going to change, and it's going to change quickly. Elisha said, "Listen to the word of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh, tomorrow about this time a measure of fine flour will be sold for a shekel, 2 measures of barley for a shekel in the gate of Samaria." The royal officer on whose hand the king was leaning answered the man of God and said, "Behold, if Yahweh could make windows in heaven, could this thing be?" Then he said, "Behold, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat of it." Almost a kind of a reverberation of what had been pronounced on Moses. I think we talked about that. You will see it, but you won't enjoy it. You will witness it, but you will not eat of it. You're going to have donkey head still in your mouth flavor, Donkey head jerky is going to be there, and you're going to see everybody else eating bread, freshly baked bread. Aren't I so articulate? So descriptive. I've gotten in trouble with that. describing, I think somebody's probably still retching from my description of Goliath's head being removed and how difficult that is. Years ago. Anyway, so there were 4 leprous men at the entrance of the gate, verse 3. And they said to one another, why do we sit here until we die? If we say we will enter that city, then the famine is in the city and we will die there. And if we sit here, we die also. Now therefore come and let us go to the camp of the Arameans. If they spare us, we will live. And if they kill us, we will but die. Now these are lepers. They're going to die of leprosy eventually. They don't have a choice there, right? They're going to die of leprosy. They're already living a stricken life anyway. This is a weird place to be. They're sitting in the gates of the city under siege. They can't go out because that's where the enemy is. They can't go in because they're unclean. They're stuck. They're going to die there. They're going to die should they go in the city. And so they decide, well, we're at least going to go die where they have groceries with the Arameans, right? So you're going to do that. Oh, I should advance because some of y'all are reading off that screen, aren't you? Buy a Bible with bigger print. All right. They arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Arameans. When they came to the outskirts of the camp of the Arameans, behold, there was no one there.
I love that.
I do too. It's pretty cool in this case. Nobody's here at all. Imagine, well, I could tell you, I told you I was not a normal real estate agent when I was a real estate agent. One of the main things that we did was tax sales, tax lien foreclosure sales. So I would do that. I learned how to do my own title searches because nobody will do a title policy or title search for sheriff sales. So I would do all that research, and I went and found a property I remember out in Lake Hills near Medina Lake. Back in, this was 20 years ago. And we bought it at the auction. Good deal. Whatever. So we own the property. The company I worked for, the individuals that I managed these properties for and researched for. So a couple of us went out there, and we walk in, and the place is fully furnished. The utilities have been off. All the P-traps are dry. It smells like sewer gas in the house, but it is fully furnished. Underwear in the drawer, towels on the racks. You know, utilities have been off, and it was the weirdest feeling in the world. We were just waiting for some kid to come out of a closet with a shotgun. You know what I mean? Like when you walk in, utilities are totally off. It was the weirdest thing that I have ever felt. It felt dangerous walking into that house like that. And then we found out horrible, and the property tax system, we already talked about this, right? It's criminal in Texas. It's criminal because it does this to people and it allows this to be done, for one thing. The people who bought that house bought it on a contract for deed that was never filed by the owner. So the person that lost the house was not the person paying for the house, if that makes sense. So he had never filed it. He never paid the taxes in 10 years, and finally it went up for sale. So these people all of a sudden show up while we're there, thinking that they were not living in that house, but they had been making their payments and thinking that they still owned it. And we didn't. We owned it. And they didn't own it, and neither did the guy who didn't pay the taxes for 10 years. And so they also did not have a right of redemption. So when you do that, this long story to explain why this is so terrible, right? But they did threaten violence on me in my house because of that. And I was like, I don't know who you are. You were not on any paperwork. You were nothing, right? Which is why I don't do it anymore, by the way. I'm aiding and abetting the state in their criminal property tax scheme. So I got sick of that. It's not legal to do contract for deeds like that anymore anyway. But it is dangerous, right? It was dangerous. The only thing I've ever been shot at was doing that job. I did not get shot, but I was shot at. Similar situation. We didn't buy that property. Yeah. So it's dangerous, right? So I'm just trying to build it. When you walk into a camp like this, we're going to read the description. This is not feel good time, right? Even if you're a leper, they don't necessarily know what's happened. We know. For Yahweh had caused the army of the Arameans to hear a sound of chariots and a sound of horses, even the sound of a great army, so that they said to one another, Behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to come upon us. An oddly specific assertion. And I wonder if they had some intelligence to that end, that was trying to be done. And therefore they arose and fled in the twilight and left their tents and their horses and their donkeys, even the camp, just as it was, and fled for their life. So you can just imagine, this is like having, underwear in the drawers and towels on the racks, right? You have horses tied up. Now, I'm not a horse person, but what's the first thing that people do when a barn is on fire and it's got horses in it? They run in and let the horses loose so the horses stay safe, right? I mean, they don't let them die. You don't let them tie them up. You can't even tie up a dog in El Paso County anymore. Literally, you cannot tie them up even with water and shade. And these people fled and left all of their very valuable animals tied up in the camp, just as it was, right? So things like the latrine door was probably open, right? Mid-wipe, that kind of thing. The kitchens are cooking, the pots are full, the dishes are on the table, so to speak, right? This was a rushed retreat. And so when these lepers come to the outskirts of the camp, they entered one tent and ate and drank. Boy, only a leper would do that in an enemy camp, right? Carried from their silver and gold and clothes and went and hid them, and they returned and entered another tent and carried from there also and went and hid them. They're having a field day, right? I mean, this is a rich camp. They've got everything that Israel doesn't have. But I'll tell you what, I would not go and sit down at that table and eat anything or drink anything from my enemy's table, not knowing exactly what had happened, right? These are not prophets. These are the lepers. We know more than they knew. It's kind of dumb to go drink right off your enemy's table without them there, without anything. But then they have a moment of conscience. See, right now they don't have a political career, right? Because they have a moment of conscience. In a moment, we're not doing right. We are not doing what is right. This is a day of gospel. Good news. We're not doing right. We are keeping silent. If we wait until morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now, therefore, come, let us go and tell the king's household. So they do that, right? They have, who knows if they still have their little caches or whatever. I might leave a silver cup in a hole in the ground too, with little conscience problem. But they do realize that they need to, well, I mean, because the spoils of war in the ancient Near East, I mean, it belonged to the people who conquered the enemy. Who conquered the enemy? Well, Yahweh did, but he's also not interested in their stuff, right? So a silver cup here and there, whatever. So they do. They came and talked to the gatekeepers, or called to the gatekeepers of the city. They told them, saying, We came to the camp of the Arameans. Behold, there was no one there, nor the voice of a man, only the horses tied and the donkeys tied, and the tents just as they were. And the gatekeepers called and told it within the king's household. So this is weird news, right? They have laid siege long enough and severely enough that women are eating their own children and bargaining with each other to eat the other one's children. That is a degradation from the point of selling a donkey head for 80 shekels, right? That's something that should not be done, should never be heard of in the land of Israel. It certainly does not have to be heard of in the land of Israel if we read the covenant correctly. That was their choice, was to eat donkey heads and babies. That was their choice. So they went and they described this thing, and understand sieges weren't always successful. Sometimes they could be broken, but this was a very successful siege, and it is very suspicious that the Arameans would have left. So the king arose in the night and said to his servants, I will now tell you what the Arameans have done to us. They know that we are hungry. Therefore they have gone from the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, when they come out of the city, we will capture them alive and get into the city. So there's a reason the 4 lepers go in and hide everything, right? They hide their stuff and they eat and drink and they have a little party before they have their moment of conscience. And there's a reason those guys aren't the king, right? The king is sharp, right? I tell my children this, I was raised to never think of myself as smarter than anybody else. That was the biggest, dumbest thing my parents could have ever told me, was to treat everybody as if they're smart. Everybody is not smart. Everybody is not even average intelligence. Quite frankly, we've rigged that system. There's a reason that some of these guys are lepers, some of these guys are servants, and some of these guys are kings. The king would be wiser to avail himself of the conditional promise that God had given the kings of the northern kingdom. But he is making a wise decision here to approach us with caution, right? He views that as for the risk that it may be, for the deception that it may be, that this is an attempt simply to solve the siege problem. So one of his servants said, "Please let some men take 5 of the horses which remain, which are left in the city. Behold," this is kind of a hard sentence to translate, "they will be in any case like the multitude of Israel who are left in it. Behold, they will be in any case like all the multitude of Israel who have already perished. So let us send and see." Basically the same thing that the lepers said. We're dead men anyway, so let's try to get one last snack, right? Send these guys in, take 5 horses. It's a fairly small risk to the people that are going in. So they therefore took 2 chariots with horses, and the king sent after the army of the Arameans, saying, "Go and see." So they do that. Minimal risk involved. They went after them to the Jordan, and behold, all the way was full of clothes and equipment, which the Arameans had thrown away in their haste. Then the messengers returned and told the king. They are, only Yahweh can do this, right? You ever been, probably y'all are good Christian people and have never been confronted with an out of balance threat, right? No? You ever had 5 guys, 6 guys around you threatening to beat the ever-loving tar out of you? No. I have a couple times. See, I told you y'all were real Christians, and I'm not really. You know what I did? I was stupid. This was a long time ago. I kind of thumped my chest and said, "Well, we'll give it a shot." I didn't run away leaving my clothes behind me, much less throwing my weapons or my tools or my keys or leave my car behind, whatever. The kind of terror that a whole army who is trained to encounter conflict and confrontation has to have instilled in them, to throw everything away and literally run off basically in their underpants. This is the clothes and equipment which they had thrown away. Even the stuff that they were carrying on their back, they didn't want to be encumbered by. So the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans, which was their right to do. They were the victors functionally here. We've gotten kind of soft on this one lately. I don't think at least the first half of Vietnam was the last time we let people bring any trophy pretty much they wanted to bring. But it's part of understand conquering an enemy involves more than the violence. It's partly the humiliation, right? So how many of these Aramean soldiers are going to have their underwear hung up on the wall around Samaria because they ran? Because that's what we used to do in Boy Scouts. You'd wake up and underwear would be up on the flagpole if you didn't do your laundry. You know what I mean? There's a corrective element here, right, of humiliation. Back when Boy Scouts was Boy Scouts, right? My Catholic grandparents really loved the movie Sister Act with Whoopi Goldberg way back from the early 90s. You ever watch that movie? My dad's favorite line in the whole movie, because he loved it too. He grew up Catholic. He loved it, right? And when the one nun says, "Those were nuns." Somehow they lived without running water, without shoes, without groceries. Those were nuns, Anyway, these guys, the humiliation is part of it. The degradation. Don't come back or we're going to spank you again. leave your clothes out here, we're going to make fun of you for it. And it is a necessary thing. I think our modern mentality, I forget who it was. It wasn't somebody that old. It was a retired military officer said that America is not at war. America is at the beach. The U.S. Army is at war. And that distinction that we think of as militaries being at war while the nations are going to Disneyland or the beach or wherever is going to destroy modern nations. You need to understand that warfare is between peoples, civilizations, which are broken down into nations. And it's not the military of the United States that the Islamic republics that are trying to rule the world hate. It is the United States, particularly because we support Jews in the nation of Israel. And we have historically done so for a long time. And so do not make the mistake that they only hate the guys with the night vision and the little laser pointers and the guns and the bombs. They hate you, and they would kill you if they had a chance. That's how that would be. So they understand this, right? The people are the ones. It's not the armies that go out and plunder. It's the city residents that go out and plunder because they're the ones that had the victory. And they're the ones there. Measure of fine flour was sold for how much? A shekel. Look at that. I think Elisha mentioned that. 2 measures of barley for a shekel. Barley was considered kind of the lesser grain. The Romans considered it kind of a diseased form of wheat that should really only be fed to animals. It's just a totally different species, but they just considered it bad wheat. A little bit cheaper. Still, 80 shekels for a donkey head. This may not be a great price, but it's better than that. I haven't done the conversions or whatever to know if it was a good price. But the king appointed the royal officer on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. But the people trampled on him at the gate. It's a rough way to die after a siege breaks. And he died just as the man of God had said, who spoke when the king came down to him. It happened just as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, 2 measures of barley for a shekel, and a measure of fine flour for a shekel will be sold tomorrow about this time at the gate of Samaria. Prophecy has a little bit of ambiguity in it sometimes. Yes, because he didn't say it will be at thus and such minute, right? You know somebody that celebrates their birthday down to the minute? I know some people that do that. It's weird. Don't do it. You have a birthday, not a birth minute. All right. Yeah. Anyway, so even in the prophecy, right, about this time, roughly this portion of the day, that'll happen. So that's fulfilled. It happened about that time. Then the royal officer answered the man of God and said, now behold, if Yahweh should make windows in heaven, could such a thing be? And behold, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat of it. And so it happened to him, for the people trampled on him at the gate, and he died. Lest you think it was an accident. Terrible thing. Well, we could make some applications, but you're probably maybe preaching to the choir. Do you have any questions, comments, accusations of heresy or otherwise, of extreme correctness? I always throw accusations of heresy, but you can also tell me I'm extremely right. I would take that. All right. Why does famine happen in the land of Israel? Discipline. Yeah, famine happens. Famine was the norm. You understand? Famine was the norm. I was reading today, speaking about an analogous, there was a famine near the end of British colonial rule in India. I think it was 1876 to 1878. It has a name because it was so bad. There are pictures of these Indian men who are literally just skeletons. Every rib, every bone in their face is showing through their skin, protecting their family from cannibals roaming the streets for those 2 years. That's the norm in the world, is famine. Famine, cyclical famine. Certainly the norm in the ancient Near East. It was not to be the norm in the Promised Land. It was not to be the norm among the nation of Israel. It was only a consequence of discipline. And so they relegated themselves, right, not to This is the part of the judgment, right? You just made yourself like everybody else when you disobey. You no longer avail yourself of the distinction that God has granted you by his grace when you do that. I'll say there's probably an analog there to how we live our life, whether we embrace the promises of God or not in our life, whether we avail ourselves of the privileges that come with our identity in Christ or not, those kinds of things. We can say that. But also, what happens, and this is where I was going to go, and this is why we get nasty comments on our live stream occasionally. So what causes famine in the land of Israel? Disobedience, right? Generally cyclical, habitual, ongoing disobedience, unrectified without the law being applied to rectify it. What causes famine in Israel's enemies? How did the Arameans lose all their stuff in this one?
Trying to take over Israel.
Yeah, doing violence to Israel. So you have people complaining, right, about Israel, people who, if they had opportunity, would kill every last Jewish person in the entire world, complaining that they're starving. The Bible has an answer for that. Cut that anti-Semitic crap out. Stop being genocidal maniacs, and then you won't starve. That's how that happens. That's how that works. I had a former, she's a long-time family friend years ago comment or something on a post. They had something like that, and most of the girls that were in the traditional Southern Baptist church that I attended as a child have all become liberal wackos, to the point that some of them are pastors in denominations that also ordain willy-nilly homosexuals, transgender, everybody, right? They've gone off the deep end, right, from where we all started. And there are, that infants and children aren't genocidal maniacs. Nope, you're right. And if you cared about your infants and children, you wouldn't be a genocidal maniac towards Israel. Yep. If you cared about your children, Israel cares more about those children that are starving than their own parents do. And I know that that's a theological answer to what appears to be a geopolitical problem, but we need to understand it does have a spiritual answer, has a biblical answer. Yeah, Becky.
I was just thinking too that the scripture talks about God's dealing with nations that divided his land.
Right.
And that's one of the things that our country and other countries are doing. Okay, let's just give them half of the land.
Right. And you need to understand. Are you horrified by story? And this has direct an analogy actually, because it's the same cultures who are doing this to Israel. But in certain cultures, if a man rapes a woman, the woman is forced to marry the man. That happens. That happens today. That's not 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. That could be in Iran or Afghanistan today. Are you horrified by that? None of y'all are not. Oh, there are 3 people nodding their head. Everybody nod your heads. You're horrified by that. You don't make a woman marry her rapist. It doesn't happen. Now, would you make somebody live with somebody who had threatened them with murder for their entire life, multiple times a day? You wouldn't do that. But all of a sudden, we're supposed to give Hamas their own land right in the middle of Israel. No. Do you know how many Jews there are in the Islamic world? It has drastically decreased. They used to have freedom of religion in many of these Islamic countries. They're in the single digits in many of the Islamic countries in the world because they've been killed and they're not allowed re-entry, and they die, but they're not able to have any replacement. Such is not the case in Israel. There are tons and tons of Muslims in Israel that have the freedom to exercise their religion, as long as it's not one that commits genocide, right? As long as you don't take it that far, they can do that.
They have voting rights.
Right, they can vote. Yeah, exactly. They could vote and deal with this issue, right? That is the case. That's the nature of the way that country is run. Now, I will say, because I have offended people about this, frequently recently, you cannot have freedom of religion with people who don't reciprocate.
Yep.
Does that make sense? Like if their religion says that everyone has to die or convert, that's not, you don't get freedom of religion with people like that. And that's applicable to the United States. Everybody's upset because they're kicking out truckers because they can't read English. That's a big deal. I've almost been killed by many truckers here in El Paso here recently. But we need to be real careful about putting somebody into Congress or elected positions with budgets that are practicing Muslims, because that is sedition. That their religion has codified sedition, and they hate you. They hate you. And they hate Israel, they hate the Jews. And Israel actually is learning that lesson, I think. They tried to create a secular state and allow the pre-existing Muslims to live there. It's a caution to everybody who thinks they can do that. You can't. And most of the religions of the world just lack opportunity, right? They don't value freedom of religion. The Judeo-Christian tradition largely is responsible for creating that concept, but it was part of an experiment. And I think that experiment has proven that you can't do it with the way the religious makeup is in the world today. So, do I believe in freedom of religion? As long as I have it too. As long as I have it too, I believe in it. Fine. Anyway, what causes famine? Sorry, people talk about the Old Testament like it has no application at all to today. Since October 7th of 2 years, it has incredible applications to what Israel is doing, what they have a right to do, what the precedent is that they're basing their decisions on here. And this guy is struck dead because he did not believe God, even in the northern kingdom, which was largely apostate, right? So they're Jewish enough to be accountable, right? Which is another thing that comes up a lot. All right. So, any other questions, accusations of heresy or extreme rightness, correctness? Okay. All right. I'm going to add that into my list. Elisha spoke to the woman, chapter 8, whose son he had restored to life. You remember that story, right? She didn't ask for a baby. She got a baby anyway, and the baby dies in her lap, old enough to say his head hurts, and then brought back to life ultimately after a couple of runs at it, right? We talked about the nature of God's working in the world. Sometimes it takes some experimentation and some failure to do that. Yes? No? Short term. So that's who this is, right? Elisha spoke to the woman whose son he had restored to life. Arise and go with your household and sojourn wherever you can sojourn, for Yahweh has called for a famine, and it will even come on the land for 7 years. This is, we've got precedent for this, right? This 7-year famine, right? So the woman arose and did according to the word of the man of God. She went with her household and sojourned in the land of the uncircumcised Philistines for 7 years. That's what they call them. It just says Philistines there. They're dirty dogs. But, David did this, actually. Didn't he? David ran off and sought protection in the house of the Philistine king to preserve his life. There's certain... Well, it's just what God has done. God demonstrated, right, that principle in the nation because he sent the family of the patriarchal family into Egypt, not only to preserve their lives, to feed them, right, but also to build a family into a nation of people and to preserve their life and preserve their identity, right, to give them the land of Goshen in which to maintain their identity without interference until the moment at which he was going to take them out. So long precedent for this. It also deals somewhat with kingdom theology here, right? And that is the famine was coming on the land, and the people who were faithful were not exempt from it. Elisha would experience it. If the woman stayed, she and her family would experience it. Because when the kingdom is not functioning, right, believer and unbeliever suffer the same. We've made that point in Matthew, and that is when the unpardonable sin was committed, nobody in that generation got the kingdom. Believer or unbeliever, apostle or not. When you're one of the 12, you didn't get the kingdom. If you had sacrificed everything and left behind family, friends, farms, income, and whatever else, you still didn't get the kingdom, because the kingdom comes upon the believer and unbeliever, and the absence of the kingdom is felt by the believer and the unbeliever, and they suffer in its absence, even now in the divided kingdom. So the only way to avoid it in this case was to leave, so she did. And at the end of 7 years, the woman returned from the land of the Philistines, and she went out to appeal to the king for her house and her field. She had been gone long enough that it had reverted to the state, which will happen to you too if you don't pay your outrageous property taxes in the state of Texas. Well, it'll actually happen other places. But we have acres and acres and acres in New Mexico that cost $200 a year in taxes. There's a few zeros missing off the rest of your property taxes for that, aren't there? Right? Texas is insane. Criminal. But it will happen, right? The state, it will revert. And that story that I told you earlier about the tax lien investing that we did in Texas, if it's your homestead property, you have 2 total years to redeem the property. If it was your homestead property, you lived there, that was your primary residence, the first year you paid 25% of whatever it costs to buy that property. You pay 25% premium. Second year you pay 50%, but you get it back. But you do have to go and appeal to the state. You got to file your paperwork, etc. You've got to exercise that right and that privilege. And that's what she's doing, essentially. It had reverted to the king, and she wanted it back. And there was a record of that, right? She was a woman of note. The king was talking with Gehazi. Blah, Gehazi. Turkey. The servant of the man of God. That's what Scripture calls him. The servant of the man of God. Men of God are often served by turkeys, though, if you notice. All right, Peter's kind of a turkey at certain times, you know. Gehazi, it would almost be a sitcom. Like, it sounds almost like a situational comedy sometimes that the men of God are served by people like Gehazi. And he said, please relate to me all the great things that Elisha has done. And as he was relating to the king how he had restored to life the one who was dead, behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life appealed to the king for her house and for her field. Coincidence, right? He's telling the story at the moment that she's having this revealing or trying to appeal for it back. Just a coincidence. And Gehazi said, my lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son whom Elisha restored to life. So when the king asked the woman, she related it to him. So the king appointed for her a certain officer, saying, restore all that was hers and all the produce of the field from the day that she left the land, even until now. Now, this king's a turkey too, isn't he? He makes all sorts of, I mean, there's no good decisions being made pretty much, but even Ahab had a moment, you know, a glimmer of repentance, and God honored it. Why? Now, this was a rich lady, right? Her property is probably, I mean, we're just going to extrapolate a little bit here, right? Valuable. Otherwise, the king might not have probably claimed it, you know, as an estate. Why would he be prone to simply agree and actually appoint a personal officer to make sure that everything was restored to her? Oh, the Lord's judgment. My coffee got cold. Too much talking, not enough drinking the coffee. Anyway, so think on that one for a little minute. We got 4 minutes. I'm not gonna let you chew on it for 4 minutes.
So maybe if God had saved this boy's life, well, in both of their lives, I guess, then maybe the king didn't want to be responsible for.
Oh, maybe he was worried about judgment on himself. That should have been like when the Pharisees wanted to kill Lazarus again. Right? They didn't have that thought. Oops, we probably better not kill that man. Yeah, maybe that's it.
Maybe he wanted to stave off the 7 years of famine.
Okay, maybe he, maybe. Yeah, that has occurred.
That's right.
May
Be in the good
if you,
graces of God.
I think. Well, any other comments? Any other
Yeah,
observations? Yeah, Bill.
The woman knew Elijah,
Yep.
and perhaps the king is thinking, if I'm really nice to her, she'll put in a good word with me.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Okay. So maybe this will make the prophet happy. They were friendly with each other. Maybe that's right. Because Elisha doing something isn't necessarily a guarantee that the king is going to think that's good or being popular, right? Yeah, Josh.
I wonder if the king sees God's favor to her and thinks she's probably in the right.
It could be. So all of those things may be contributing. I think what he sees, right, is that God's favor has been evident in the northern kingdom of Israel still, right?
Yeah.
And this was a case in point that God had not abandoned the concern of life in the northern kingdom. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
There was only one, as I recall, is this the only resurrection? No.
Yeah, well, the one where he touched Elisha's bones or something.
Yeah. But this is pretty big news.
Yeah.
And good news is few and far between in the northern kingdom of Israel, right? The northern kingdom is started by a calf cult on the north and on the south to try to prevent people from having to drive to church. Sorry, not church, you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
People get upset if you ask them, tell them, look, if you find a Bible teaching church within an hour, go there. Drive past as many as you have to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And people act like you have just shackled their ankles and hung them upside down. Time to grow up. But I think that he wants to put this kid on a poster and say, look, God has not abandoned the northern kingdom, which is true, right? God has not abandoned the northern kingdom. We still have this word, even though it's a political thing, I'm sure. God's favor is on the land, and look, I am in accord with God's favor. I'm going to restore this inheritance, this heritage to the son. The son is the key here, right? Because her husband was to die heirless, right? Up until the point that Elisha granted the son to her. So I think that this is the poster child for God's favor still being available to the northern kingdom. I think the king is probably muddled on what basis that comes, right? But it was exceptional. Does that make sense at all? That is what happened. That is the kind of the signs of things. You wonder why the Gospels record when Jesus was raised that there are all sorts of other dead people walking around.
Yeah.
Like, what was the sign? What was it? Well, it was evidence, right, of who Christ is and the power that raised him. That just kind of almost the reverberations were enough to bring people out of their grave. Just kind of the afterglow almost. That God is who he says he is. His favor is upon whom he places it. Yeah.
It seems interesting that it's in the context of the king asking about all the things that Elisha did.
Yeah.
This is kind of like
the
king playing God by doing this great favor to the woman.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, so understand this guy's functionally he's a pagan, right? And he has not availed himself of any of the generational promises that God has given even the kings in the northern kingdom. Because we've read those explicitly. He said even to Ahab, right? Ahab, if you walk in my ways and you do what I say, then your land will be fruitful and you'll be safe and happy. I mean, that's how it's going to happen for the benefit of the people, not because Ahab's a good guy or he's married to a good lady. Simply because the people are still God's people, right? And they can avail themselves of that covenant. But I have to think that this is the only thing he could find useful politically to some degree in the long list of things that Elisha had done, right? That was something that he could do and something that he could advertise. And it is true. God's favor is still upon the people, even in their discipline, right? And that's something that we need to understand, too, is that God's discipline is God's grace in the life of a believer, in the life of the nation of Israel, because it is absolutely his favor upon you that corrects you, right? Those are not a dichotomy, right? So occasionally we have people from a kind of what we call a hyper grace view. I don't know if you've heard of Andrew Farley or Bob George was a guy generation earlier. wrote a book called Classical Christianity. And for him, classical Christianity is God doesn't spank any of his children. He only hands you an ice cream cone. There's no divine discipline, right? And to think that God disciplines his children is to, essentially in their minds, to pollute God's grace, right? That's a pollution of God's grace in their mind. And here's the why that they'll say that God's discipline, if you're going to view discipline in the world as anything, that is simply natural consequences, right? So let me just explain God's discipline, the church's discipline, your parental discipline. All discipline is designed to prevent you from experiencing the natural consequences of your behavior, right? Because a spanking is better than getting hit by a car. I have had both. I was hit by a car and I've been spanked. I will take the spanking than having blood on the brain and a concussion and for losing my memory, right? Categorically worse. So it is a measure, it is God's grace. It is God's grace in our life in the Northern Kingdom. He has given them Elisha and his ministry is God's grace, that he has not allowed them to suffer no consequences at all for their idolatry. They are experiencing famine and violence and war and difficulty and the wickedness of kings. And that is all disciplinary in their life and is an evidence of God's grace. Because what happens when people are not specific recipients of God's grace geopolitically? Their nation just disappears. We don't even know how many people, groups, civilizations have just disappeared in history. We just have no idea. We know the biggies, some of them. We still have whole categories of people that we can't even read their language. And we know people talked about them and we're scared of them, but we found no evidence of their existence, like they just ceased to exist. But God's discipline is designed to preserve, protect, and provide for the future of the of the nation of Israel. So it's restorative. All right, does that make sense? So I think this is evidence of God's favor even upon an apostate nation. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. We thank you for your word, and we thank you for Elisha. Father, as evidence that our ministries aren't that tough, at least, right? That Elisha and Elijah, his predecessor, ministered in such a difficult and apostate nation, and yet you bless their ministries. Thank you for their example of faithfulness